Okay. So tonight's speakers are
Let's see this wrong.
I'm sorry. All right, please mute your mics. Thank you. Dr. Felicia Gibbs is the Vice President of Practice Capacity of the American Occupational Therapy Association. She is a developer of self-regulation and mindfulness exercises and worksheets for sensory processing disorder, ADHD, and autism spectrum disorder, as well as co-author of Raising Kids with Sensory Processing Disorders. In addition to children with autism and sensory processing disorders, Dr. Gibbs has interest in cultural competence and treatment intervention. Also tonight, we have Mr. Stacy Wilson, who is supervisor of acute rehabilitation services at WakeMed Hospital. He is an AOTA emerging leader and is passionate about investing and increasing recruitment and retention and diverse students in the profession. To do so, Mr. Wilson established a scholarship at UNC Chapel Hill to increase diversity in occupational science and occupational therapy. He is also a founding member of COTAD. Ms. Lauren Jones is an occupational therapist in the University of North Carolina Health System. She is also an AOTA emerging leader and continues to use her talents as a special interest section coordinator for the North Carolina OT Association, Emerging Leaders Program application reviewer, and creator of Gotta Be OT. Ms. Jones is also a member of COTAD and serves as the editor of the COTAD Courier and COTAD.org. And again, I am Dr. Kalia Johnson. I'm an assistant professor in the Division of Occupational Science and Occupational Therapy at UNC Chapel Hill, and affiliate research associate in the Center of Cultural Experiences in Prevention and the Department of Psychology at Virginia Commonwealth University. Broadly, my research interest centers on community living for African Americans with intellectual and developmental disabilities. And I also serve on COTAD as coordinator for tonight's COTAD conversations. And we are admitting more people from our waiting room, so bear with me. Okay. So let's get into it. Now, I don't know of our participants tonight who attended the COTAD Live keynote or who attended the UNC CEU event, but we unpacked structural racism, specifically the ways discrimination is taken up and reproduced as systems of oppression, and how individuals continue to perpetuate oppression through microaggressions. And you know, we can experience those microaggressions through our patient care, but also from colleagues. And we received dozens of questions related to managing microaggressions with patients, and if we treat it as unchallenged bias or willful racism. And so the first question or topic of discussion we want to tackle tonight is if our panelists can speak to how you differentiate bias and racism in clinical situations. And so Stacy, Lauren, and Verlicia, whoever would like to go first, if you could discuss your thoughts on that.
I guess I should go first. Should I turn on my camera?
Yes, please.
Yes, okay. Let's see if I appear. All right. Are you able to see me? My sun
Yes.
is now setting here, so I'll have to turn the light on soon. But I guess in terms of looking at the unconscious bias, right? That was the question versus racism within healthcare setting.
Mm-hmm.
I think for me, and I have to give my disclaimer that my thoughts are of my own and not the association, even though people may agree, but these are my own personal thoughts, that the unconscious bias is really, those are those, you know, the microaggressions, the implicit biases that we all have, right? That they're there, that may be lurking in the background, and it's up to us to be able to recognize them and to do the work to be able to address those biases. Whereas I feel as though racism is, in my opinion, somewhat of a conscious effort or a lack of effort to, rid yourself of biases. And whether that's in a healthcare setting or not, that's my opinion on how to define them. And I think the challenges within the healthcare setting is that we're there. The majority of people should be there if you're a professional to help others, right? And so that comes along with the responsibility of compassion and empathy for the people that we encounter, and that includes your coworkers.
Stacey or Lauren?
Sorry, I started talking, but I was muted. So I totally agree with what Marlisha said. For me, of course, unconscious bias are those things that, occur unconsciously. And if you have a brain, you have a bias. So it's a thought that it's something that you have and something that you act on, versus more so what I'll consider racism being, putting into practice something that's actively trying to be exclusionary or putting someone else at a disadvantage. I think they both obviously can negatively impact the people that you work with, the clients that we see, and they both can be, equally damaging, unfortunately. So I think that just because, something that happens, unconsciously, or it's an unconscious bias, I think a lot of people tend to think that it's a little more innocent or a little more benign than, say, racism. But I think both of them have that capacity to be able to just have devastating effects, not only to the clients that we serve, but also to, ourselves, the coworkers that we are encountering. And I think it can cause, a negative environment for the person that it's against.
Lauren, is there anything you would like to add?
No, I'm listening into my colleagues here speaking, and I would agree in saying that in this particular question on the slide, I'm wondering if it's in the workplace with patients directly, the experience of unconscious bias versus racism can be difficult to tease out. For example, it could be that a lot of the staff who a patient has worked with, who are people of color, may not be occupational therapists or physicians or nursing staff members. And so when they ask you to do something or let you know that something is wrong and they need housekeeping services, for example, in my own experience, that might not be racism. That might be everyone that I've seen, right? So this unconscious bias, everyone that I've seen working here is a person of color who is in roles that aren't typically a therapist. But to agree and kind of echo what Stacey said, the same idea that racism is more of, and Marlisha as well, is more of an action. So making a decision about who's going to provide your care, what sorts of things people of different backgrounds can do for you, can't do for you, things like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it's really about, like, as you mentioned, how these ideas, the stereotypes and belief systems that we have about particular people, how come to act on them, then determines how we label them, which is very interesting. I think sometimes we talk about and the effects of which I think directly impacts how we engage with our patients, but also with each other, which I think really brings us to this next slide, and specifically thinking about how bias and racism impacts us individually, but also as a system. And so I want to share this video for all of us to watch and ponder over.
The effects of racism in the workplace can make you feel very uncomfortable, very stressed. It can lead to mental health problems, and it shouldn't be something that any member of staff has to tolerate. It's dehumanizing. It makes you feel less.
Sort of paranoid. I felt targeted. I didn't feel comfortable doing my job anymore.
I was called names and told to go back to where I came from. Even though I've been here since I was 3 months workplace, anything that would kind of bring up those feelings again, it's really difficult. It makes me feel quite vulnerable again. And I think this clearly shows it's a very open wound that I don't know if it will ever close.
Makes me question my own identity, and a lot of times I ask like, why do I have this body? You know, it made me alienated from my own body, and I wish that I looked differently.
You do feel left out, and you feel as if you're not wanted or you're not valued in the team.
It definitely shakes you to the core. It makes you question who you are. It makes you question your abilities. And it can be hard to cope with. The good thing is if you have people to speak to.
Okay, I see that I have a message that the video went away. Let me try this again. I apologize. Could y'all please let me know that you see the video? Thank you.
The effects of racism in the workplace can make you feel very uncomfortable, very stressed. It can lead to mental health problems. And it shouldn't be something that any member of staff has to tolerate. It's dehumanizing. It makes you feel lesser.
Sort of paranoid. I felt a bit targeted. I didn't feel comfortable doing my job anymore.
I was called names and told to go back to where I came from, even though I've been here since I was 3 months old. So healing as an adult or as a young adult or in the workplace, anything that would kind of bring up those feelings again, it's really difficult. It makes me feel quite vulnerable again. And I think this clearly shows it's a very open wound that I don't know if it will ever close.
It makes me question my own identity, and a lot of times I ask like, why do I have this body? You know, it made me alienated from my own body, and I wish I looked differently.
You do feel left out, and you feel as if you're not wanted or you're not valued in the team.
It definitely shakes you to the core. It makes you question who you are. It makes you question your abilities. And it can be hard to cope with. The good thing is if you have people to speak to, people who have possibly experienced the same thing, who can relate to what you're going through and know that it's not just something that's in your mind.
All right. So can I get a thumbs up over back on the Google slide? Thank you. Oh, you would think of weeks and weeks of doing Zoom. I'll just do this plug, that, you know, as a professor, I would have Zoom down, but I do not. So thank you for the confirmation. So back to this video. I think this short clip from University of Manchester really gives us a little bit of a glimpse into the ways that racist environments directly influence our interpersonal relationships and also self-perception. And so over the course of 14 years now of being an occupational therapist, but also nearly 37 years occupying a Black body, I believe I've developed a repertoire for dealing with racism at the individual level, right? So directly addressing racist behavior if and when it is safe to do so. And so I just wonder, Stacey, Relisha, and Laura, what your reactions are to this video, and just sort of reflections about dealing with racism from colleagues, and the ways that you manage that and how it impacts your practice. Excuse me.
All right. You want to go, Stacey? That's fine.
I was just gonna say that listening to that video just really put into perspective how a lot of people feel whenever they encounter situations when they're faced with racism or even unconscious bias in the workplace. I know I've been fortunate to have worked with a lot of people of different backgrounds, ethnicities, people that have different viewpoints than I do. And particularly for the African American colleagues that I've worked with that have experienced these type of things, so racism and unconscious bias, there is a differentiation between the two, but the same result is just the negative impact that it feels on the person. So you got somebody who feels like they don't belong, in the organization. You have somebody that feels like they're devalued in the organization, and over time, that really begins to affect the psyche of the person. I mean, it can lead to less productivity. It can lead to more frustration. A lashing out of sorts that can be seen. Whether it be towards patients, whether it be towards your other colleagues, or your supervisor or manager, and oftentimes, unfortunately, in the video did a great job of talking about mentorship and kind of how that can be a help, but without an outlet, or without some type of a balance there to be able to say to another colleague, or if you don't have that support system, it can lead to burnout, and it can lead to a domino effect where they're labeled because somebody who's watching the management or whatever just kind of see this person and their actions are just kind of as an effect of that systemic racism or that unconscious bias that has just grown exponentially, and there has to be an out for that. And so that video did a great job of just kind of giving voices to that from other people from various backgrounds. And I thought it was interesting that you had people from various backgrounds, but they all said the same thing. I mean, so it was a powerful video for me.
Yeah, I certainly would agree. And for me, watching that, initially, I think it brought tears to my eyes. And if you're in the world of, trauma, for me, I'm thinking trigger, that's a trigger, right? That I perhaps didn't even realize was, I mean, obviously it's part of me, but I didn't realize how much on the surface it was still there, right? It doesn't really matter what your resume or CV says if you have experienced that to the level of those individuals that spoke in the video. And Dr. Joy DeGruy, I believe is how you say her last name, she writes about, and she's an academic and a professor that writes about post-traumatic slave syndrome, which for me, I feel as though it's real. We carry the wounds of our ancestors, of our parents. It's something that it's a fear within the family, and they raise you to be aware of it. But then for someone like myself, I was raised to be very confident, and you have to work this much harder, right? And you're going to be successful, but then when you leave the door and you go into that workplace, it, for me, is almost like, here we go again, right? Especially earlier, I would say earlier on in my career, I experienced that more so than now of here we go again, of having to explain myself, who I am, why I deserve to be here, and how, you know, I could be a fun person if you get to know me and not look at my exterior and exclude me. And it always worked out, I would say, for me, but in the beginning, you have to jump those hurdles, and it just becomes kind of, it's almost as if it's normal, it's your norm, and then at a certain point, you realize that this is not normal, right? And then you shouldn't have to work that much harder to allow yourself to be accepted. As a parent, it's something that, you know, I constantly think about for my children, and hopefully things will be a little bit different for them.
And that's sort of the mentioning of trauma that we, or at least I, have applied it to, you know, our clients and the communities that we work with, but sort of now thinking about the cumulative trauma of dealing with racism in the workplace, right? And how that is or is not internalized. Like I think about our students who are going into fieldwork situations or new employment situations who may not yet have either the skill to negotiate some of that and what that does in terms of their own professional development. And like you, Alicia, like I grew up in a household where I was taught to be confident, say, you know, that you're going to have to work 2 or 3 times as hard. And when you sort of are butt up against or confronted with racism, sort of here are the various ways you can handle it. And now understanding, I guess, with adult eyes now that is a lot for a child to carry, but it armed us in a way to help us negotiate the world in ways that non-people of color don't always have to think about. And fortunately or unfortunately, you know, we have to deal with it in professional circles too. And so sort of thinking back to our ethics event, you know, we sort of talked or critiqued the niceties that we experience in the profession and how sometimes we don't think of OT as being a world where these sorts of things exist. But when they do, you know, how do we deal with it? And so I go back again to students and thinking about how we arm our students, you know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, if I could add to that, I think when we talk about, you know, the implicit bias, for me, it also, I have to take some onus of that, right? Because I'm coming in with that armor on. And during my earlier years, I came in with a lot of assumptions, and sometimes that wasn't the case. So it works both ways because it's so ingrained in you that this is how it's going to be, that you make those assumptions that you won't be welcomed.
I agree, and it's easy to gotta choose my words. It's easy to feel like everything or most of everything is because, you know, it could be your race or it could be, you know, the way I talk or whatever the case may be. But I think that's a great point, Alicia, that, you know, sometimes things that happen, you know, in the workplace might not necessarily be, you know, due to the unconscious bias or due to racism. And it's good to kind of recognize that within yourself, because we do go into a situation sometimes, as everybody does, with their past experience and, you know, how you're raised and things like that. And that kind of helps how you view the world. So I thought that was a pretty accurate point of statement.
Yeah, and I'm just perusing some of the comments, and I see people talking about some of the publications coming out for trauma, and that's one of, and I'm a little biased with that because that's one of my areas of work, and have a publication as well in that. and someone mentioned generational trauma and intergenerational trauma. And there's a lot that is going on, and not to divert the conversation, but just briefly on epigenetics and how it is actually carried in our DNA, right, and passed down. So I think there needs to be some level of compassion for that, not just from people outside in, but for ourselves as well, to be able to have that acceptance and that healing, that sometimes it is something that we were born with, right? And I know I went through some guilt in regards to that myself, like, you know, at some certain point, and I know you all probably had similar conversations with perhaps friends and family, like at a certain point, you have to let it go and you have to take ownership. Well, that's easy to say, right? But if this is something that is deeply embedded within our neurological system, as research shows us, then that's a challenge for us, you know, and so we do have to have some compassion for that.
Yeah. And also having an understanding that, you know, racism is not, it's not just an act, like something that one person does to another, you know, it's a system, you know, so, you know, not only do we have to consider the biological impacts of trauma, right? But also understanding how we're really situated in an entire system that really is sort of built, like assault is the word that keeps coming to mind, but is not the word that I want to use. But essentially, right, that we have these assaults every single day. So on top of the biologic piece, right, the epigenetics and stuff we're already carrying, the system reinforces it all the time, right? And we know from the literature, racism kills, right? Mm-hmm. So, and Laura,
I think that's a great point.
I'm sorry, go ahead, Stacey.
I was just saying, I think that's a great point. And I can just see that in terms of like, you know, you think about systematic racism, and if you have somebody that's coming up for a performance review and somebody that has, you know, whether it's overt racism or unconscious bias, you know, that's all part of the systematic racism itself. So if you got somebody coming up for, you know, their performance review, and, you know, a person has this perception of them and it's largely due to their race or ethnicity, you know, that person's not going to advance, or that person's not going to have access to opportunities, you know, that maybe a non-person of color would have access to, just solely based on, you know, maybe their race or their ethnicity. And so just like you said, it just kind of perpetuates, and it's that system that is very oppressive and hard to get out of. And, you know, people end up feeling like they're defeated. And of course, with the trauma with that and the mental health issues that go into that, is just kind of a cyclical thing, and, you know, it can be really hard to get out of. And then too, you know, having a colleague that's going through that, you know, even if that doesn't directly affect you, but, you know, it tends to weigh you down too, because then now you're looking at, you know, your employer or whoever, and you're having these thoughts. And so it might lead to you being more on edge. So it really does, just because it happens to somebody on an individual level, it can affect other people, you know, corporately. So I think that's a good point to point out too, that you don't have to be a recipient of the unconscious bias or the racism to be affected.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would agree with that totally. Even I have experience of leadership prior to my current role, where I had to lead a team. And even though the person that they were speaking about wasn't the same culture, race, or ethnicity as myself, it was still enough to be a trigger, right? And to really impact the relationship that we then had after that point, based upon their comments about the other individual and assumptions about that person that, in my case, I felt was very inappropriate. And being in a leadership position, I could voice that a little bit more comfortably, but it's challenging. Let's say if it were reversed, right? And the person that was making, you know, that was receiving the comments was not the person in leadership and it was the superior that was delivering that. That makes it even more challenging. So when we address racism and the trauma of that, it has to happen at all the various levels of the organization, right? Not just at the individual level. So I agree with your comments.
And so, Lauren, I want to check in with you before we pivot and talk about anti-racism work a little bit.
No, I'm also following, like Alicia, some of the comments and the discussion there. So bouncing a little bit between listening to you all and hearing other people's perspectives. And so just having, it almost feels like a load off to just be here and talking with people who understand generational trauma and structural racism as something that does exist. It's not an urban legend. I think a lot of people are telling you to push it off. And as Marlisha said, well, get over it. That happened, slavery was hundreds of years ago. It's over, it's done with, it's, there's nothing that's happened to people who are from other ethnic backgrounds, like people who I've spoken with and colleagues and friends of mine who are Latino or Latinx or identify as immigrants. America's one great big melting pot, so I don't know what you're worried about. Everyone likes being the person of color. We're trying to recruit people of color, all that sorts of things, when in reality, kind of the experience isn't what's being spoken about. So it is, I hope maybe someone out there is listening and just feeling that relief, feeling like this is real and I experience that every day. And other people might not experience that. I've had good conversations even with my husband, who's white, and some of our friends, and just very obviously a different sort of relationship, being able to speak openly and have discussions about his perspective as a white male in the United States and his experiences with education, job hunting, walking into a room versus my experience going to interviews and having to explain to him. He's like, oh, you look really different than you normally do. You straighten your hair. Well, I'm playing the game. I mean, like having to explain, like, why would you do that? Why would you pay for something expensive to get done that you never get done? You wear your hair curly and you love having big hair. I'm like, well, I also want this job, and I don't know if this person who I'm interviewing likes people who have big hair. I think there's something to be said for being yourself and feeling comfortable with walking into an interview and saying, if you don't want to hire me because of that, that's fine. I don't need to be a part of this organization, but at some point I also need a job, right? So kind of having to, with other people, that generational experience of having to play the game. Like, you're somebody at work, you might not be at home, and kind of this dual identity, even the code switching and language. The way I talk with my one African-American colleague in the office can be different. I feel like I'm comfortable with my coworkers, but can be very different than the way I speak with colleagues who aren't people of color. But feeling like sometimes when it's just us in the office, we can be real and we can be like, when I was growing up at home and can talk to him and he understands things I'm saying and cultural experiences that I've had and things like that. But knowing that not everyone who's in this conversation or maybe will listen to this in the future has had that experience, maybe will ever have that experience, depending on where you work. And I think it really does make a difference. I'm really fortunate that I've had positive role models, and Leah and Stacy and some of the other people who I've been fortunate enough to work with and be mentored by, and know that I can be successful because of the color of my skin, not in spite of. It's not something to overcome. I'm not a person of color working to, you fought the man, good for you, you got a job and you're doing it, but you are able and you can be confident. And so I really hope that, if nothing else, someone listening will take away the importance of being with and near and supported by and heard by people who do understand and who've been there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think what you're really speaking to is having anti-racist workplaces, right? Or just environments in general where people are allowed to show up as them full selves, right? Code switching is a is a big one, right? And so, you know, can we, if we're thinking big here, like, are we, or can we as a profession or as a body, as just a group of people coming together, the whole space of this conversation, like, can we create, you know, these types of environments? And so I sort of posed this during our ethics CEU about sort of working towards anti-racism praxis, right? So if individuals are sort of forward in their anti-racism work, can we truly create environments where people are really able to show up as their authentic selves, as Lauren described? You know, how do we get there? You know, does it start with, you know, our undergraduate students? You know, does it start in pipeline programs for, you know, health professions before students even get to graduate school? You know, do we make this a part of occupational therapy curricula so that, you know, students are sort of inundated with ways of addressing it and confronting it and making it a way of life and not just something they can check off on a competency checklist for their employer? You know, what are the ways we can take this up in real ways to create environments where we all thrive? Asked a lot in that, sorry.
I think I could start kind of basic level. Show up to the interview with your curly hair. And I mean, and that's just one analogy, because we're talking about not just, you know, someone that looks like me, but various cultures and ethnicities and races, right? Different walks of life that are also going through these same experiences. But I'm going to use that as an example because I did go on an interview for an academic position, and I did have my curly hair, and it rained that day on my way there after I got off the train. So you could only imagine what I ended up with. And you know what? That, for me, I had to shine even more in terms of my skill set. And I won't say it was completely intentional. It was just, and I will say I'm over the 40 threshold. I will share that. So maybe it comes with maturity. I'm not sure. But I'm at a point where I feel as though receive me as I am, right? And in that lesson, you know, I've had conversations about things about me that other people are curious about. And I have to be able to welcome that so that we can have those dialogues. Someone may ask me about my hair, or I didn't have questions about my ethnicity, right? So I am at the point where, yeah, let's have these conversations so that then I could also highlight for you where some of those comments may brush someone the wrong way. You know, it didn't bother me much, but if you were to say that to someone else, this is how it may be perceived. So I do think, you know, we could start with ourselves, whatever you're bringing to the table, having some confidence with that, even if it's something very small, right? Because it's easy for me to say that in terms of career-wise, right? Right now where I am comfortable. That's easy for me to say versus a student going into field work that's just beginning with a lot of anxiety. But I do think start with something small that you could say, I'm going to wear this on my sleeve, and I'm going to be willing to have conversations about it.
I think also the question about what we can do to work toward here in my echo, anti-racism practices. I think, can you guys hear that? Is there a feedback or something?
Yeah.
Someone needs to mute.
Okay. Can everybody that's not talking go on mute, please? But a lot of this can be helped by a top-down approach. I think Cupola asked a question, do we think, in the chat, do we think that racism or something along the lines of racism should be included in the ACOTAD standards? And I absolutely think, you know, when you think about America getting what do they say, 2050, there won't be a majority race, you know, we're kind of moving towards this racial plurality, or where Caucasian will not be the main race in the United States. We can only expect, unfortunately, I think racism to continue and to kind of, you know, flourish during this time, while, you know, there are a small group of people who might feel like, you know, their population is dwindling out. So this is the time to act out. And we kind of see that now in our culture, kind of happening all around us. But, you know, as that's happening, I think that's an excellent opportunity for, you know, as we're growing towards more people of color being the predominant race in America, to just say that, hey, this is something we need to take head on. How do we combat this? How do we look to ways to mitigate racism? I don't think we'll ever eliminate it, but to reduce racism in our profession. And I think a top-down approach, I think it adds value whenever you can identify something and you name it and you say, this is something that we are working towards. Having, you know, year after year, clinicians that are coming out, academics that are coming out, researchers that are coming out with a frame of mind or that understanding of racism, unconscious bias, that's going to be huge. I mean, that in itself, you know, equipping everybody with that knowledge, that information, whenever they go to their respective jobs, whether it be in academia or clinically in the workforce, you know, that's going to lead to people pushing back, bucking the system in a sense, to say, hey, well, how come my hospital doesn't, I mean, for my hospital, all we do is celebrate, you know, April, which is Diversity Month, with a luncheon. Well, how is that adding to any value to, you know, people of different groups? Oh gosh, my battery's running low, guys. And things like that. And so I think, you know, even from logistically, from like a management standpoint, you know, bucking the system and saying, okay, we're not just going to do a luncheon about diversity. We're actually going to bring people in to talk about diversity. We're going to change our cultural competence, because I think most organizations have some type of a cultural competence, which of course is an outdated term, standpoint, and just kind of, you know, unpacking what is unconscious bias, what does it mean to be racist, to have racist viewpoints. How do you uncover, how do you realize, you know, those things that are within you, especially the bias portion of it. So I definitely think that could be one way to kind of work towards the anti-racist practices. And I'm going to run to grab my charger because my computer's going to.
All right. And, you know, and just to add what to Stacey said, I mean, to take it a step further and, you know, challenge your organizations to have anti-racist policies and mechanisms for reporting it, and not just reporting it, but doing something about it. You know, having some accountability for the individual, but also at the organization to say that we don't tolerate it. It's not enough to say it, but it has to be written so that they're really held to it, right? And I know that in the chat there's some discussion about like if we're really talking about racism explicitly in educational standards, but also in our AOTA documents. You know, this is an opportunity for you to speak to your RAs and other folks who serve on your state boards to even challenge the organization on the language that we use and adopt to talk about non-discriminatory practices, anti-racist practices, because, you know, I think, and of course, this is just me. These are not opinions of UNC, VCU, or any other organization that I'm a part of, but I think people who engage with me online know that I have a very strong opinion and critique about the language that we use and don't use in our documents, and we're not calling the thing, right? And that we've sort of fallen back on multiculturalism and diversity as a way to really address racism, when it falls short, right? And Stacey already mentioned that, you know, talking about cultural competence and things like that. Like what does that really do for us? And so now is the time to challenge yourselves, the places where you work, the people that you engage, and also the leaders in our profession and beyond, to really confront this thing head on. And I'll stop preaching for a second.
Yeah, and I would say as much as we can have representation, right? So at the state level, at the association level, and obviously I am a staff at the association, and so I know that there are efforts there and desires to do more, but if you have a specific voice that hasn't been represented, then I think we need to try to rally behind individuals like that to take part in those volunteer opportunities. The governance needs voices that could speak to things that others may be unaware of, right? That's that phrase, you don't know what you don't know. So sometimes individuals are trying to do their due diligence, but without that knowledge and history and background, you could only go but so far.
I think that's a nice segue into, talking about workforce diversity, speaking to representation and sort of our love for multiculturalism and diversity. I took a moment a couple of days ago to go back and look at that Bipartisan Allied Health Workforce Diversity Act. To really, sort of figure out first, what does it say about underrepresented groups? And is there real provision in terms of how colleges and universities with OTPT, speech and audiology programs use the money to really expand diversity in their programs? It's still a little nebulous to me. Alicia, you might be able to speak to that a little bit better. But I'm just wondering if we can really put our money where our mouth is on that, right? In terms of how we move forward, with how we respond to our lack of diversity, specifically NOT.
Yeah, I think with anything any type of policy or bill, right, that's approved, there's the approval process, right, and then there's the implementation piece. And once it's the bill's done, it's hands off, okay, now go and do the work. So the rollout for that, will be interesting because once it's approved, let's say it's going to be approved, it will take some time to really navigate around how it's going to be disseminated and reach the people that it needs to reach, right? So the advocacy shouldn't stop there. The advocacy needs to continue on, and that's a great opportunity. I mean, you bring up a great point that once you get the funding, let's say, to the institutions, advocacy needs to happen at that level as well. So the state and the institutional level of really helping them to navigate around it and highlight some of those issues that they may not be thinking about. It's oh, great, we have more money, and universities need money these days, right? So this is what we're going to do. We're going to just go and anticipate that we're going to get a boatload of people from different cultures and races and go from there. Well, that's not how it works, right? So there's a lot of work that needs to happen in between.
So Stacey and Lauren, any thoughts on workforce diversity, or even about the Allied Health Workforce Diversity Act in particular, excuse me, or even the new task force, right? So the board of directors decided to do a diversity and inclusion task force. What are your thoughts about that?
Okay. Well, lots of thoughts about all of these topics. So many thoughts. But being in the workforce right now, and even in the past couple of years, I think it is important for people to recognize that in order to have, as Stacy was saying, meaningful workforce diversity, inclusion, and equity, it's important to have people be on the same page about what that means. Similarly, at an organization I've worked at, they are having a diversity kind of day or whatever, like a cultural fair. And some of my colleagues, which I think this speaks to advocacy, as somebody in the comments is talking about, but I was pretty open about my passion for diversity, true diversity and equity and inclusion, and what that looks like and what that means. And so some of my former colleagues from this organization reached out to me saying, hey, we got roped into this culture day sort of thing, and we're very uncomfortable with what we're being tasked to do, what we're being asked to do. And so I asked them for some more information, and essentially it boiled down to, their leadership wanted them to enter what was essentially going to be a trifold board about their culture to show at this fair, which, as Stacy said, what does this do culturally for anyone? Would this time have been better spent recruiting people of color or people of diverse backgrounds from the LGBT community, people who were immigrants, right? People of different socioeconomic statuses, whatever category of diversity, rather than having people have a trifold board in the cafeteria so you could say, oh, whatever, I guess, I don't know, I'm African American, or I'm not sure what the theme of the event was ultimately supposed to be, right? But that's one of those things that maybe, I don't know, looks good to PR. It didn't look good to me. It didn't feel good. My colleagues were very uncomfortable. And even with the feedback that they got when they were seeking clarification about, these are 3 women who happen to be Caucasian, and they were like, not that we don't have culture, but other than being OTs who work here together and are white, we don't know what exactly they want us to talk about. And so that when they emailed, they got feedback, well, we were hoping that the Filipino nurses here would enter and submit something.
Wow.
So all that to say, I don't think there's going to be any meaningful movement in this until people who are put in charge of these areas truly understand what that means. And I agree with Kalia that it might be stepping on toes. It might be having conversations about things that are typically kept in the closet, kind of getting to the ugly, the nitty gritty of whose idea was this culture day? What is its purpose? What is the goal? Is it to show that, oh, hey, we have Filipino nurses here at this organization? Or is it to truly get feedback to show that you're meaningful, valued part of this organization, right? So that is my first thought. Not all of my experiences have been negative. I've also been in situations where I felt uncomfortable about situations that were happening at work, and I've had managers who were very supportive and spoke with me very openly about, tell me what you're experiencing, how can I support you, can I connect you with somebody? I don't think make this right is the words, but I want you to feel supported. I want you to feel like this is a safe workplace. And to not have that brushed under the rug meant a lot to me. To have a manager who says, I'm sorry that this happened to you. That sounds really challenging. How can I help you approach this and work through it? Even if it's not with me, can I connect you to somebody, or can I get you the support that you need? And so I agree, similarly with the task force, I really hope that we'll be looking at that systemic level of, again, are we as an organization, AOTA perhaps, or other organizations, simply looking at, kind of a numbers game, like we want to increase the number of people of color in our profession by 10% by the year 2020, or are we looking at equipping people to tackle issues of racism, those sorts of things? So I think, like you said, kind of what is the goal of this task force? What is it going to be? Is it going to be trifold boards in a cafeteria to say that we had something, or is it going to be digging into topics, situations that are potentially very divisive and very challenging? And I think that remains to be seen, but I hope it's an opportunity that can move forward in a way that's meaningful.
Mhm.
I agree. And I think you can't have diversity without inclusion, obviously. You have to make environments that are welcoming of, all people. It's not enough just to say, oh, we have a staff of 20 OTs and 2 of them are African American, 1 of them is Spanish speaking, or whatever quota you have to meet. I think a lot of places look to fulfill a quota and just say, hey, we've got this diversity, but they do absolutely nothing with it. And in doing so, what do you have to show for yourself? And I think just being able to, even more so from like a kind of bottom up, ground up approach, just, if you're in situations where you are employed and, they have these type of events, then, make suggestions. I think some places are more receptive to feedback. I know from my employer, they ask for those type of feedback. What can we do to really celebrate diversity? And they ask for input on that. So making sure that we kind of speak up. I mean, obviously we're not to be the ambassador for every single thing, if you're a person of color or a different race or ethnicity. But at the same token, if we want change, it helps to kind of push the conversation forward. And I truly believe, because diversity tends to be one of those buzzwords that, either people gravitate towards or they try to avoid. A lot of people try to avoid it because it can be uncomfortable. But the only way we can make it to make it not uncomfortable is to continue to talk about it. And the more that we are engaged in conversations, initiatives, and things like that, the less of a stigma is behind, diversity. And it should just be something that's common to just say, to include it in the normal conversations, and to be, open to say, yeah, I do have this unconscious bias, and this is something that I need to address, or this is something that I could improve on, and not being afraid to, own up to that. But I don't think that we can have or effective diversity without that inclusion aspect, because if you don't feel welcome where you are, if you don't feel included, just like that video, going back to that video, then why stay there? Why be there? Or, so I don't know. I'm hopeful that task force will kind of address those type of things to empower people to have voices, to be able to collaborate with other folks, and to just really, push the agenda forward in regards to diversity and inclusion and even equity. So.
Yeah, I think you bring up a good point too about what just kind of spoke to me was that we kind of avoid it like the plague, right? It's like you don't really want to talk about what it really is. It makes everyone uncomfortable. But, overcoming this, sometimes we talk about it as if it's, I don't have to overcome being a person of color, right? That's not something, you don't have to overcome your sexuality. There's nothing wrong with you that we have to overcome. And this is actually an issue for all of us. And we should be at the table, but we also need to realize, and every, at the systematic, the organizational level, I would say, that the realization is that if racism exists, it's an issue for all of us. Right. And I heard someone say, and probably more eloquently than I can, that to have a race requires more than one group, right? Innately in the word race, it really positions us to like a race to the finish, and it opposes us in a way. So we have to realize that it doesn't take just one group to have this racism. So everyone is involved in that.
Yeah, thank you all for excuse me, for sharing that. And I want to, acknowledge that we've gone into the chat here for an hour already. But I do thank you, Lauren, for, engaging everybody in the chat. But I do want to turn it over to Dr. Stephanie Lancaster for a second to see if there are other questions in the chat that we could address that maybe we haven't yet in our discussion.
Thank you.
And I will add,
Go ahead.
I'm sorry, real quickly, I just wanted to say, and in a little bit, I'm going to jump off. We have our AOK's business meeting that's online. So
yes, I know, I saw that.
Yes.
Conflict. But yes, thank you. I guess, Stephanie, if we could just do one question maybe.
Okay, yeah, well, as it so happens, there's tons of great comments and even some resource sharing and just people saying that they agree and can relate to what's being talked about. But there have only been 2 questions, and one has really been addressed. So we really just kind of have one, and it was specifically for Dr. Johnson. You mentioned a statistic in the first racism and OT event. Maybe the number of times the word racism is mentioned in OT journals, and the poster was asking again for that number if you happen to have that.
Oh, that is race is discussed, but racism is not specifically discussed, like, at all.
So 0.
0 is the answer.
Okay.
No,
Okay.
not at all.
Yes. Oh, well, that's an easy number then.
Yeah.
And the only other thing that came up, and this has been bantered about between you all, is should racism education be part of the ACOTAD standards?
Yeah, I mean, I believe we can't really talk about diversity, equity, inclusion, every other, so like, racialized concept in any of our professional documents without also talking about racism, right? And I'm not, yeah, it's a hard thing, and I don't personally don't understand why it's not there, because you can't, you just cannot divorce racism, both institutional and structural, from everything else that we've been talking about, you know, because all of these issues that we confront as individuals of color, but also as practitioners working in multicultural communities, are in some way articulate to racism as a system. And so I think it should be included as part of a standard. It should be included as part of, like, anti-racism work as part of our practice codes. We just need to be more intentional and explicit about how we address it.
Thank you. Well, I'll continue noting questions. Everyone feel free to keep posting, and we'll come back around to them later on in the conversation.
Okay.
I have to exit.
All right. Thank you so much, Felicia,
Thanks
for
for
joining us.
including me. I appreciate it. Have a good night, all.
All right. And so, we actually got through that. But since we, are over an hour in, I know a lot of people want to go so that they can attend the AOTA business meeting. But I do want to first thank the Coalition of Occupational Therapy Advocates for Diversity for really holding space for this type of conversation. And to all of our panelists, and to Dr. Stephanie Lancaster for participating in this, and also to all of you for registering, participating. I know you guys are going in the chat, and we really hope that this COTAD conversation is not the last time that you have this conversation. That there's been some great capstone projects around race and racism in occupational therapy practice and workforce development and all these things. So please continue to share those with us so that we can help promote it and keep people engaged in this conversation. And so with that, bid you all good night. Please stay safe and healthy. All right, good night.
Thank you.